Okay, I am going to go over the work that I've achieved to date. Let me just contextualize what I'm doing yet again. So, I study information behaviors. I study information literacy, how people find, evaluate, and use information sources. And I've studied that in lots of different ways. And this particular study is of first year writing students in the context of their research paper, their term paper. And I got 5 research participants out of a class. I interviewed them before and after their research paper, and I also did this with their instructor before and after. So before it's the paper started, and then after she graded them all. And I also did several in-class observations in which students were working independently, learning about information literacy, learning about how to find information online, and then actually doing that on their own computers. So this first iteration is just me making that data usable. So I have that data in audio files, and then my observations were just typed in Microsoft Word. The audio files I'm importing into Premiere Pro and then making transcripts that way. So I've made a transcript of it, and then I can export it, and it ends up looking something like this. I then have gone in and I've started to style it. And what I need to do is make sure that everything is styled in a way, and I'm talking about applying Microsoft Word styles to the document so that when I import it into NVivo, it actually recognizes those styles. So it'll recognize who the speakers are. And then I've also started to import or put the questions in as well in a different style so that later in NVivo, if I'm like, okay, I want to look at all of the responses to question 3 in my first interview, I can do that by bringing up this text. And I had to know a little bit about NVivo to know how to do that. And that was a little bit rocky because I started out just importing it as text and cleaning it up that way. But it turns out it's actually a lot easier to do this pre-work in Word. And then once it's somewhat ready, import it into NVivo. And that's what I did, or that's what I'm in the process of doing. So here's a different interview that I've imported into NVivo. And in my next go around, I'm going to be listening to the audio at the same time as I'm going through and cleaning up these files yet again. So I'll be taking those things out. Like if I have several of my name here, because it's, I was speaker 1, then I'm going to take those out. So it's just one big thing of text. So my name isn't showing up as much. Just making this a lot more usable, and then also going through the text to make sure that it is representative of what was said. In doing this, I've been doing tutorials. NVivo has several that you can access within the program itself, but I also have been looking at YouTube ones, and there are quite a few from qualitative researchers, from also libraries, from universities that have taught me how to do different types of things, and that's helpful. In terms of the current interpretive results from my work, I have a few gut feelings based on having conducted the interviews and listened to them again now multiple times at this point. And I'm going to take those feelings into coding with me, which is an interesting thing to consider. On the one hand, I know this data very well, and I'm already starting to analyze it in my mind, and that might change the way that I approach coding. Versus if I was just looking at these interviews and I hadn't conducted them and didn't know as much about them. So I'm grappling with the implications of that, having kind of collected the data myself, and not having distance from it. In terms of findings, I'm not sure how to say this quite yet, but one inkling I do have has to do with the way students are talking about bias. And I'm going to need to pay attention as I code because they're not always using that word, but I think they might be getting at it. And I need to think about this more. Maybe I'll call it bias anxiety. I would ask what types of sources they thought were authoritative and which ones they do and don't use. And they would hedge a lot when they're talking. They didn't want to appear biased in the kinds of sources they said they used. And some of them said, oh, that source seems biased, or da-da-da-da. And other people were talking kind of around the subject. I need to think about that more, this kind of performative objectivity and which would be hard for me to necessarily prove, uh, except for that I did do in class observations as well. But it's also constrained by the kind of study that I did, where I was coming in as a researcher about research and asking them about their research behaviors and maybe them wanting to present themselves in a certain way. Um, and so there's some interesting power dynamics baked into the study in that sense. Maybe a little biased. um, in terms of the way that my interactions with the participants in practicum have impacted my work to date, I've been mostly thinking about what we talked about in the work plan and the coding categories I'm going to be creating. And I've really been hovering between the angst of creating them and the types of violence such categories have and continue to perpetuate. Um, and also thinking about my own expertise, not only as somebody who knows this data set quite well, but as somebody who's been studying information behaviors for a long time and thinking if anyone's going to be creating categories, I'm pretty uniquely qualified to do so. So, still needing to recognize my own vantage point is always going to have blind spots. Now I think that I'm performing objectivity. Oh my gosh, this is getting. Anyway. Um, Elements of my project that I tested or prototyped in the work cycle and how the results have informed my plan. Um, I haven't prototyped a whole lot. It's really just data cleaning. I did have to know a bit about in vivo during this part of the process. And luckily, I had already decided that I was going to use in vivo for this study when I collected the data to begin with. But that's just something I've learned over and over in DSAM is thinking about the tools that I'm going to be using when you're collecting and cleaning the data before using the tool, and what the constraints are and the affordances are of those different digital ways of interacting with a data set. In terms of successes and struggles, I think it's been pretty intuitive. I'm feeling like I can do this. Um, Add the codes, play around with this, and find some interesting things from what I have here. I have had to scrap the project and try it over again because I wasn't formatting the stuff correctly, but I've figured that out. And in terms of questions that I have for my audience, what I need help with, I'm thinking a lot about the mixed methods nature of this study. So I do wonder how I could implement my observations into the data. Mostly what in vivo does is allows me to code and then look at where those codes and how they're showing up and find themes and do some analysis that way. But I have this whole other data set of me just sitting there watching these classes and typing up what I'm seeing happening. And I don't know quite how to use those. I don't think I can code them the same way. The codes wouldn't make sense to just transport like the same codes into that. Um, I'm thinking maybe to contextualize or back up findings from interviews. So if I'm seeing themes in the interviews, then I'm like, and this is what I saw students doing in class that either supports that or not, or maybe contextualize it in that the teacher presented the information this way, and maybe that's why I'm seeing the things in the interviews. But yeah, the mixed nature of the study is an interesting one, and in vivo does allow for that. I can put all of my field notes into this same project. I can have different, kind of different types of data in one project, and so it really does allow for that type of interaction. But that's something that I'm thinking about and grappling with a little bit right now.